But my perspective is that we're missing another part of that equation. Human rights is worth the fight, but nobody's ever talking about the perpetrator. Everybody's talking about the victim. And of course, I totally respect that. And victims need to be acknowledged and they need to get their rights back. And we have to stop the injustices. And humans are really good at, like, in some ways, I'm really proud of humans. I'm surprised that we're not more awful than we are. Like, we've really learned to be civilized in amazing ways. So even the fact that, in this century, probably, or the last century, is when we really started as humans saying, let's get together commissions on human rights. Like good for humans, you go. Like, I'm putting a positive spin on it. Like, it's beautiful that we do this work. But because I'm a psychologist, I'm interested in, well, I'll just say it, I'm interested in the dark side of all of us. And I'm not the first person to be interested in it. The Buddha talked about the dark side, and Jesus talked about the dark side. Jesus had something that he said that always resonated with me, even though I was brought up Jewish. And that's, he said, let he without sin throw the first stone. And Jesus was a ninja, man. He understood that he and the Buddha, people like Rumi, Freud, Carl Jung, lots of very insightful philosophers and religious teachers over the years realized that we all have a dark side. And why does it actually manifest in some people and not other people? But to not acknowledge that we have a dark side is really missing the other half of the equation, is the way I would say it. I am trained as a neuroscientist and I think like a scientist. And sometimes I'll give a lecture to people and I'll say, humans are in a predicament. We're in a predicament because we're half animal and we have all the same animal systems, like adrenaline for fear and dopamine for motivation. We're animals who really ultimately make ourselves number one. You can call that the dark side, the animal side. Like, I sometimes say, look, if you put down a plate of food for 3 hungry dogs, they'd all go for it. Nobody would wait for the other dog. And nobody would ever look at the dogs and go, oh my God, that's so impolite. There's 3 of you, you should share. Humans have the same motivational system of wanting to eat first. So I guarantee you that if you went to someone's house and you hadn't eaten all day and they put down the food for a buffet style, you would, all the motivation mechanisms in your body would want to go and grab the food first because you're hungry. Now, we don't do that because we've learned to become civilized. So the predicament that we're in is that we're half animal that wants it our way, and we're half divine. Or I'll say we have a divine-like responsibility to act with right action. And I don't know how many of you follow Freud, but one of Freud's last books was called Civilization and Its Discontents. And he really lays out the struggle between those two sides, the animal that wants what we want. I want all of the jewels in the kingdom. I want all the land in the kingdom. So I want it all. I don't care if you peasants are starving. Me. And when humans started to realize that what's really best, the greater common good, is that that's not going to work. The greatest common good is civilization, where we learn to cooperate. And quite frankly, I think it's amazing to see humans having been on this journey since we can remember, of how do we do this thing? How do we make it work? So getting back to the study of the dark side, to understand that is where the healing begins. I'm interested, the other people on this talk are doing the hard work of fighting against human rights violations, and that work has to continue. It has to be stopped. Bad behavior has to be stopped. But I'm coming in from the other end and saying, what's going on for the perpetrator? Why do people do these egregious things? And I'm sure none of you will be surprised that there's classic science behind that question. I'm curious if anybody's looking, she's going to talk about the Milgram studies, from the 1960s. Stanley Milgram did a very beautifully executed study. And if you don't know about it, I'd like to just briefly remind you what it was. After World War II, people were so disturbed. How could the Nazis do these egregious crimes, commit these egregious crimes? And I also want to bring up South Africa. I'm looking at my own timer, and I don't have a lot of time left, but I often give talks contrasting how people healed in South Africa after the end of apartheid versus in Nazi Germany after the end of the Holocaust. And they had very different strategies. Just simply put, South Africa was very interested in restorative justice, led by Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. Beautiful. I can talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work all day. And of course, the Nazis were more about retributive justice. They were just looking for the people who had committed the crimes, and they were just going to hang them. There was no healing in that sense. But anyway, back to what I was saying about the dark side, and Stanley Milgram. He did these studies in response to the Holocaust by having people come into his laboratory, and he sat them down. They were called the teacher. So they were the participant, but they were called the teacher because he said, you're going to be given the role of teaching a person who's sitting in a booth how to link words together. So what I would like you to do is I'd like you to read out the word cat and teach the person on the other side of this wall that when you say cat, you're expecting them to remember to say the word fish, because you're teaching them, hey, guess what? Cat goes with fish, and car goes with doctor, and apple goes with sheep. And then you start to test them as the teacher. So the experimenter, who might be me, you're the teacher. I said, listen, you're going to have to teach this person on the other side of the wall. And the way we're teaching is that we're going to give them negative feedback when they get it wrong. We want to see how that works. And so your job, teacher, is that every time the person on the other side of the wall who you're teaching gets it wrong, you're going to just administer a shock to them. Of course, the person on the other side of the wall is a Confederate. They're in on the study. They're in on it with me. And so that person is faking it and screaming when the teacher, who is you, the subject that I'm testing, gives them a shock when they make a mistake. And when they make a mistake, I say to you, please turn up the amount of voltage, because we're going to actually make it more painful, more negative feedback. We want this person to learn. Let's give them this negative feedback. And you look at me and you go like, are you sure? Because this is a pretty high voltage. And I go, yeah, trust me, I'm the scientist. I know what I'm doing. Please follow the protocol and shock them. And some people, many people, you, the ones I'm looking at here in this call, shocked people up to lethal amounts, even though, of course, it wasn't really happening. It was being faked. But those were pivotal studies in the field of take an average person who thinks that they're a good person and put them under right circumstances or certain circumstances, and bad stuff happens. And that's what I'm interested in. That's what my lab studies. We study dehumanization, we study racial and gender bias, but we're trying to understand it from the perspective of the perpetrator so that we can make things better. But the thing that I want to say, and I'm just looking at the last few moments here, is that we're all perpetrators. If you think that you don't have a dark side, you don't know yourself very well. Now you might go like, oh, I would never do these, but you do some version of it. And even if your version of violation is this small, we all violate on some level. We violate people in minor ways all the time. And it's that integration of understanding that part of ourselves when we're doing the human rights work, so important, in my opinion, is to understand that you're working with other humans on the other side who are doing these things, but they're human too. And they're suffering. Anybody who does something horrible is suffering themselves. So I think I'll stop there. I know Brianna didn't put her finger up, but I feel like that's a good way to wrap things up. I would very much welcome feedback.